Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Scrutiny Management Panel meeting. I'm Councillor Simon Drosha, and I'm the Vice Chair of this panel, and I'll be chairing it this afternoon. I would like to draw your attention to the following. Housekeeping. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and the public gallery via the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at Queen Victoria's statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with the Guildhall Fire Marshal regulation, if you've signed into the Guildhall, please remember to sign out when you leave the building after today's meeting. Live streaming. May I draw everybody's attention to the fact that this meeting will be live streamed and that the cameras will pan to those speaking. Members of the public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those that stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. May I remind members to use the microphones when speaking and to turn them off again once you have finished. If you don't turn it off, the camera stays on you. Please can I ask members and officers to introduce themselves, starting from my left. Chris.
Chris Ward, Director of Finance and Resources.
James Harris, Senior Local Democracy Officer.
Councillor Stuart Brown.
Councillor Susie Horton.
Councillor Graham Heaney.
Councillor Roman Dent.
And Councillor George Madgwick.
Thank you very much, members. I have apologies for absence from Councillor Ian Holder, Councillor Abdul Qadir, Councillor Mary Vanley, and it also says I've got an apology from Councillor Susie Horton, but she seems to be here this afternoon.
I was coming back from my holiday, Councillor Bosher, and I came straight here.
Oh, bless.
There's dedication.
Okay. Agenda item 2. Do any members have any interest to declare? No? Well, agenda item 3. Minutes of the meeting held on the 24th of July 2025 and the 15th of December 2025. Have members had a chance to actually have a look at the minutes of the two meetings? Okay, well, I will look at the 24th of July first, and I'll just go through them page by page. I'll use the big numbers. I've got page 3, page 4, page 5, and page 6. Any comments, members, at all? No, in which case duly agreed. And moving on to the minutes of the 15th of December. I'll take these with the big numbers again. Page 7, page 8, page 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 and 14. Members happy with those minutes? Okay, thank you very much, members. That's that business done. We now move on to why we're really here, and agenda item 4, Portsmouth City Council Budget and Council Tax 2026-27, medium-term budget forecast 2027-28, 29-30, and the capital strategy 2026-2027 to 2035-2036. And what we'll do, we will start with a presentation from Section 151 Officer Mr. Chris Ward. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. So what you have before you is a presentation of the budget report, so the Budget and Council Tax Setting Report and Capital Programme that was published just under a week ago, due to go to the Cabinet tomorrow for consideration, and then onward to full council on the 24th of February. Obviously today is your opportunity to scrutinise the budget and to make any recommendations that you feel that you might want to the Cabinet tomorrow for their consideration. So what I thought I'd do is just give you the right at the outset, just give you the headlines. So it's entitled Budget on a Page, and it seeks to tell you the whole story of the budget on obviously on a single page, but in very high level summary terms. So it focuses on next year. As we go through the presentation, I will talk about the current year, but just for the purposes of setting the scene, we set out what next year's financial position looks like in terms of the budget and council tax proposals, as well as what new capital investment is proposed for next year, and if we look forward ahead a few years, what our overall forecast financial position looks like all the way through to 29-30, albeit accepting that that might be a year after which local government reorganisation has taken place if it goes ahead. So in terms of 26-27, the spending or the council's net expenditure is due to increase by 16.2 million compared to the current year. So the big drivers of that, as is usual, are the big spending areas of the council, which is social care, so that's both adults and children's social care. Additional spending in those portfolio areas of 11.3 million. We have some quite significant pressures in what we describe, what's abbreviated to SEND, which is special educational needs and disabilities, in part, or at least for the most part, related to homeschool transport. We'll come to that as we go through the presentation. There's additional capital investment. This might sound odd because I'm talking about the revenue budget, but it's the revenue budget's contributions to the capital resources that are available. So there's an increase in capital investment of 2 million. So what that means is that ordinarily we set aside around about 3 million a year. So now we are suggesting or proposing that that is increased to £5 million a year, probably for reasons that will become obvious as we go through the presentation. And then just to ensure that all services are able to provide for steady state services, all services receive an inflation uplift of, in aggregate, excluding social care, of 0.7 million. The social care inflation is included within the 11.3 that I previously mentioned. And of course, there's proposed savings within the budget of £3 million. Taking all of those together, it's an increase of net spending of 16.2, but that's obviously after taking away £3 million worth of costs through savings. As you'd expect, if you are to prepare a balanced budget, your uplift in spending is matched by your uplift in funding. Funding is also up by 16.2 million. The headlines on here are that the government funding is up by 16.1. That's partly presentational, actually, and it will appear when you see the budget papers that it's up by 16.1. But in actual fact, it's less than that, because 6.6 million of that actually relates to existing grants that we already receive. It's just the way that the funding becomes classified. But presentationally, it appears to be a 16.1 million increase, but it's 6.6 less. Council tax, this looks actually small, which I'll come to as we go through. Council tax income is up by just 0.8 million. That sounds odd in relation to what is to come on this budget on a page, which is a 4.99% increase in council tax. But it relates to the fact that in the current year there was a big surplus in terms of council tax income collected versus planned, and so the uplift looks a lot smaller than it actually is in reality. I'll probably explain that further as we go through as well. And business rates is a reduction of 0.7 million, which is, that's all tied up with the way that the local government funding review has taken place this year, because there's a wrap up of not just the funding that you receive from government grants, but also the system of business rates retention. So you almost have to look at the two things in combination rather than separately. I've mentioned that there's £3 million worth of savings proposals within the budget, and that represents just about 1.7% of what we describe as portfolio spend. So what you would normally expect in terms of your cabinet members and the operation of their portfolios, if you take them in aggregate, it equates to around about 1.7% of their spending. Proposals for a 4.99% increase in council tax, that's the maximum, 2% of which is provided for adult social care and passported directly to adult social care for them to provide social care services. Capital programme this year, actually it's modest in comparison to previous years. That also ought to become apparent as we go through, or the reasons for that ought to become apparent as we go through the presentation. But significant sum of money, but in relative terms, modest, at £18.5 million worth of new capital investment. Not all of that 18.5 million is council funds, some of it is external funding. So that will be described as we go through. And as we wind forward and look to 29-30, our overall forecast deficit now is anticipated to be £3 million. If you remember when I did this exercise a year ago, because it's a rolling forecast, it's updated each year. We have a new year at the end of the forecast, and the first year falls off because as it rolls through and time passes. When I gave you the forecast a year ago, it was for a £9 million deficit. So there's a reduction in the overall forecast deficit going forward. In part, that's due to a better than anticipated local government finance settlement. Okay, so if we just remember where we've come from as a council and the level of savings that have been made, and also what the council tax position looks like and where all the council's pressures are. So since 2011-12, which is usually referenced as the time that austerity kicked in, the council has made £113 million worth of savings. Now, obviously an enormous number, but if you set that against what the scale of the council's net budget, so the scale of the council's net budget the current year, 240 million, so 113 million versus current spending of 240 million is a very, very significant amount of money and a very significant level of savings that have been made over that whole period. Important to recognise where the key spending areas are within the council and what proportion of the council's net spending is spent on adult social care and children's services. It's about 2/3 of all net spending. So you can see that in any kind of financial strategy, particularly if savings are required, those areas have to be part of the solution. Otherwise, a disproportionate burden falls on 1/3 of the council, and therefore you can quite easily start to imagine that if all of the burden of savings fell on 1/3 of the council, you would start to really significantly eat into the level of service that's other services that are provided. You may recall that Portsmouth actually is a low taxing authority. If we compare ourselves to our statistical neighbours, then our level of council tax is 9% lower. So, which is significant, and it's significant in monetary terms as well, because in monetary terms, that amounts to £10.7 million. So if we were typical or the same as the average, and taxed the same as the average, the council would be spending £10.7 million more than it is today. Obviously, they are choices that the council have made, and they've chosen that money in people's pockets is a higher priority. The council is also what's described as a low tax base authority. So that basically means that if we look at ourselves compared to the average of councils, then our average band is a band B. Most people talk about band D. I think band D is I would describe it as a benchmark rather than an average. It's not the national average. The national average is probably about band C, but the benchmark of band D is used. Portsmouth's average is band B, and if we look at ourselves compared to all other unitary councils, our tax base is about 13.7% weaker. So that means that we are collecting, when we're collecting council tax, we're collecting it from band Bs, which recovers a smaller amount of money than it would be if it was if our average was a band C. That is very significant when it comes to local government funding and how the local government funding formula works. I'll come to it later, and it's part of the reform of local government funding as well. But broadly speaking, the lesser amount that you raise in council tax, the more grant funding you get, and vice versa, which I'll explain in more detail as we go through. So in overall terms, that basically means that the council receives a relatively low level of council tax income from its residents. In absolute terms, it's a big amount of money, it's over 100 million, but in relative terms, it is small. And historically, the financial pressures, as you will be well aware, have come from social care, but we are starting to see it come through, at least in the general fund, what we describe as the general fund now, through special educational needs and disabilities, and that's largely because of over the past few years, the number of education, health and care plans has more than doubled. And that often brings with it a requirement to provide homeschool transport. Temporary accommodation, you'll be well aware, also has been a cost pressure for the council, albeit it's now reducing, it's still significantly above 24-25 levels. So, as you would expect, the council has a financial strategy, and I think it's served the council well, but our overall aim, of course, is to, and it has to be the aim of any organisation that needs to remain sustainable, is that your expenditure matches your income and funding. Once those two things become out of balance, and become out of balance structurally and on a sustained basis, then that's when councils find themselves in very serious financial difficulties. So we have a medium-term strategy that seeks to do that, but it has a focus around it as well. Part of the focus is around regeneration, mainly because improving prosperity, for example, reduces residents' demand on council services, reduces need, improves lives, and usually improves outcomes. So we have the objectives, obviously, to remain in structural balance over the medium term. You can have years where you are out of balance, so your expenditure may exceed your funding. If that happens, then you draw on your reserves, but that's not a sustainable position. It only evens out temporary ups and downs between your spending and your funding, because, as you know, once it's gone, it's gone. Nobody replenishes your savings account unless you do it yourself. So I said at the beginning of the presentation, this is really a focus on next financial year, but it is as part of the whole budget exercise, we do look at the current year and make any revisions to the current year's budget as necessary. So, like I said earlier on, the council's current budget is about 240 million. So the proposal in the budget papers is to revise the budget to 240.2 million pounds. That is broadly the budget that was approved by full council in February of this year. We have some increases in expenditure, but it is offset by increases in funding. So some of the additional funding that we had is basically passported straight through to services. So if we get additional funding, we passport the funding, and then there's additional spending as a consequence. So it remains in balance, you'll be pleased to hear, but there have been some significant some significant calls against the current year's budget, which I'll take you through. One of the biggest is whilst it's being funded from the revenue budget, it's because of a forecast overspend on the capital programme. We don't hold a contingency in the capital programme for overspendings, but we manage that through the revenue budget and the council's corporate contingency in the revenue budget. So the Port Shore Power Scheme is anticipated to be around about £4 million overspent. And also, in order to provide a capital programme going into next financial year, which is sufficient to meet the most essential needs and business critical demands on the council, there's also an increase contribution to capital in order to supplement the capital resources that are available for next year, because they weren't sufficient to meet the basic needs of the council's new investment. The budget accommodates forecast overspend in temporary accommodation and maintenance, actually. So the temporary accommodation forecast overspend is around about £4 million in the current year. When I say overspend, I mean over and above 24-25 levels. We did plan for that when we set the council's corporate contingency in the current year. So in that sense, it's not an overspend, but just relaying to you that we are accommodating an additional £4 million worth of spending on temporary accommodation, which is over and above 24-25 levels. That is coming down. It peaked last year, I think, at something like 5.5 million. And some of you will recall that was a key focus of the budget for last year. It's this year, but it was approved in February. But there was a key focus in there to acquire additional housing accommodation, and there's a £30 million programme of acquisitions aimed at acquiring additional accommodation so that we can accommodate temporary accommodation, and we are seeing the results of that through the reduction in the annual revenue cost of temporary accommodation. Similarly, on transport, there are three key areas that are, I say overspend. They're overspending against the portfolio, but they were anticipated to be funded from the parking reserve. But obviously the parking reserve is not infinite either. So there are cost pressures over and above those that are in the structural budget, if you like, or the ongoing budget around concessionary fares, the park and ride, and tendered bus routes. I've touched on children and families and SEND, but we do have an overspend in the current year on children, families and education. As I've mentioned, that is in relation to three main things: home to school transport, the cost of accommodating care experienced, I don't know, shouldn't really call them children, should we? Care experienced people, because they're young people, yeah. And agency staff as well, whilst we have a shortfall against our social worker establishment, but that is also moving in the right direction. We have done better than planned on our interest from investments, so that's our treasury management function. So any surplus cash balances that we have during the year of a temporary nature, obviously we invest those securely, but to try to get the best return that we can, and our cash balances have been higher than we anticipated, so our returns are greater than we anticipated. All of those things are accommodated within the revised budget to ensure that we still have a balanced budget for 25-26, and just as the original budget approved had a contribution to general reserves of 0.1 million, that's the difference between your spending and your funding, so does the revised budget. So it's pretty much the same. I think if you look at it within the papers, I think there's a difference of 29,000 in total, so it's not bad. So 26-27. So this is the main focus of the budget meeting on the 24th. So we start with looking at what have residents said about the council's spending priorities for 26-27? So we ran a consultation. We ran that consultation over the autumn, and we had quite a good response, a better response than 2025. And you can read into that response a 95% confidence level. And for the statisticians amongst us, they often use confidence levels with a margin of error. So there's 95% confidence that these results will only have a 2% margin of error. So in terms of service priorities, what the residents said to us through the consultation was that their first priority, by 69% of respondents, making sure that people feel safe and supported in their homes and home and communities. Their second priority in order was regenerating major sites, homes, jobs, and so forth. And the third priority was around recycling opportunities and effectively being environmentally responsible. Interestingly, also, the consultation also suggested that 59% of respondents agree with the current level of spending by portfolios. So if you look at the relativity of spending with each portfolio area, 59% of residents thought that looked about right. In terms of capital investment priorities, obviously, if you read the budget consultation, it's not framed in this way, but we've looked to elicit out of the budget consultation those responses that are directly related to the preparation and the decisions that you will be making as part of the budget decision. So the capital investment priorities, as you might anticipate actually because of what was said around service priorities, regenerating major sites. That was the top ranking priority. Increasing recycling opportunities, that was the second ranking priority. There's a common theme here between service priorities and capital investment priorities. Then followed by transport systems and journey times, investing in public space, and as part of the sea defences, building new homes, healthy lifestyles, investing in leisure and sports facilities, and downsizing the council's civic offices. So that's what residents said to us as part of the budget consultation. I'm doing all the background stuff at the moment before I get into what the budget proposal's for. So another piece of background is the next slide, which is about and what does the funding look like for local government for 26-27? And bear in mind, this is now following the fundamental change to, or the fundamental, should I call it reform to local government funding. It was entitled the Fair Funding Review. Alongside that was what's called a business rate reset. So, and you have to think of the two things together, which hopefully will become apparent when I explain. So, the Fair Funding Review was effectively an opportunity to review all of the, now this hadn't been reviewed for over a decade, all of local authorities' underlying data or need, if you like, so need indicators. So all of that stuff around, for example, what's your relevant populations for adult social care and children's social care? What does the index of multiple deprivation look like, and how has that changed over time? What's your general population? And it looks at lots of different things when it talks about your relevant population for all of these different areas that have formulas attached to them in order to be able to allocate funding. So for example, take adults for example, it'll say what's your adult population over 65. It'll also say what's your adult population over 80. It will also say how many of your adult population, for example, are on income related benefits. And it asks there's a whole lot of information that gets updated as part of that exercise. It was also an opportunity which the government took to change the way the formulas work. So it wasn't just about the data, it was also about the formulas that are used. Importantly, as part of those formula allocations, what happens is you end up with what's called what used to be called a settlement funding assessment is now called a fair funding allocation. And then the government say, okay, we've now established an overall quantum of what they believe our relative need is compared to everybody else. So everybody accepts that local government isn't funded for absolute need. You're not funded for everything that you either need or would like to provide as a council. But there is a pot, and then you get your fair share of that pot according to this formula. The formula then goes on to say, well, we've now worked out what your share of need is, but you can fund some of that yourself locally through council tax. So that becomes a deduction from the amount of funding that you get, because you will still get that funding, but instead of getting it through government grant, you'll receive it through a smaller amount of government grant and your council tax. So when I talk later about the impact on the council of the Fair Funding Review, do you remember that previous slide where I said Portsmouth City Council's tax base is 13.7% lower than the national average? That means that the council ends up getting more grant because it can only fund it has less amount of council tax to fund its overall need. And that's the way that, in broad terms, the way the local government funding system works. Now, I said business rate retention is also part of that, so just to make it even more complicated, we have this system called business rates retention, where, broadly speaking, unitary authorities get to retain 49% of all business rates collected. 50% goes to the government, 49% comes to Portsmouth City Council, and 1% goes off to the fire authority. So that 49% is received. There's an assessment of what our baseline of that is, and then as you roll forward between what are called resets, you get to keep any growth from a baseline. So if it goes up by $500,000 the following year, you get to keep 49% of that. If it goes up by another $500,000 the following year, you get to keep 49% of that, and so on, until there's a reset. When you get to a reset, all of that growth is taken away, but it's given back through that process I've just spoken to you about in terms of relative need. So what happens in reality is a redistribution of that funding. It stays within the local government funding system. I can see the frowns, but it does make some sense. So what happens is all of that additional business rate income that's raised locally now gets put into the national pot for need and is redistributed according to those formulae that I mentioned earlier on for adult social care, children's social care, and so forth. So you get to keep it locally based on where it's generated. After a period of time, it's swept up and then it's reallocated on the basis of need. That's the system. So over time, you get to keep these slices of additional business rates, then they're lost and it gets redistributed based on need. Then it's lost and redistributed, and you go through these cycles. Whether that genuinely is an incentive or not to grow your local economy, not sure, but obviously the equation in here is how much do we retain locally and how much of that locally retained need do we then get redistributed back to us through this process. Anyway, that's probably a level of detail I didn't need to go into. But anyway, that's what's just happened. So it's complicated. It went through 2 rounds of consultation, and broadly speaking, the upshot of it is that those local authorities that have higher deprivation and lower ability to raise council tax do better, and those that don't do worse. So, like I said right at the top of the presentation, overall funding has increased by 16.2 million, but some of that, 6.6, was already in the system, so on a like-for-like basis, it's 9.6. 7.9 million of that has come through this thing called the fair funding allocation, which is what I've just described. We've got other grants of 1.6 million on top of that, and they are specific grants, but they're counted as part of the core spending power calculation, which is the one that government tends to rely on when it talks about how much funding has been allocated to local authorities. But it relates in the main to temporary accommodation, homelessness. It relates to what's now called Families First funding. So it's prevention type funding for children's services in the main, and a few other smaller grants. I mentioned earlier on about the business rate retention. That's quite difficult to explain because of this whole business rate reset, but presentationally it looks like a £0.7 million reduction. That gives us and a council tax increase of 0.8. In overall terms, as I've said, funding up by 16.2. Also part of the settlement is that as part of the settlement, the government sets the referendum thresholds for council tax, or otherwise known as the capping limits. So the capping limits for next year are 3%. This is for a unitary authority anyway. It's a 3% increase for general purposes, though that's everything other than adult social care, if you like. We're allowed the opportunity to add 2% for a social care precept, so long as it goes to fund social care expenditure, which gives you that 5% maximum for a unitary authority. It's a 15% limit for the Police and Crime Commissioner, which equates to 5.45%, and it's £5 for the Fire Authority, which equates to 5.69%. So if we turn to, and what does that mean for a council tax proposal, and what does it mean to the resident of Portsmouth? I mentioned earlier on Portsmouth Low Taxing Authority, average Band B. That Band B for Portsmouth is currently £1,484 per annum. Not everybody, of course, pays the full amount of council tax. You might be a single person. You might receive a single person discount. You might have another kind of discount or exemption. You may be entitled to local council tax support, for example. But in overall terms, 57% of all households pay the full level of council tax, so 43% receive some form of exemption or discount or local council tax support. The proposal next year is for an increase in council tax of 2.99% for general purposes, so this is not the adult social care precept yet. That raises 3.2 million, and it equates to 81 pence per week for our average council taxpayer, and an increase for the social care precept of 2%. We have also seen, I mentioned the tax base earlier on, so the council tax income is not just about how much you increase the council tax, it's about how many people pay the council tax, and that's broadly described as the council tax base. We have got a reduction in our council tax base by 366 Band D equivalents, so that's more Band Bs than Band Ds, obviously. And the main reason for that is that we've got increased uptake of local council tax support. So if more people are claiming local council tax support, then that's less council tax income, and it reduces your tax base. That has the effect of about £0.7 million. So what does that look like in terms of the tax proposal itself? You'll see on the screen that for a Portsmouth resident, it appears that it's likely that all of the precepting authorities, the council, the Police and Crime Commissioner and the Fire Authority will increase their council tax to the maximum permitted levels, which would see an overall increase of 5.08% to the resident. So the budget proposal is for, or the overall budget proposal is for £3 million worth of savings. You will see those in Appendix C of the budget report. On the whole, there is relatively little impact on the service user. Much of it is related to what we would probably describe as efficiencies or additional income. As I've mentioned, there's an increase in spending of 6.2 million, and now we break it down. So this is where the big numbers are. So the big numbers are adult social care 6.3, children's social care 5 million, SEND 1.6 million, other inflation I've mentioned 0.7 million. We're covering the cost of temporary accommodation going forward into next year, obviously on a declining level, but 3.7 million, and there's £3 million worth of savings. There's obviously risks within the budget, as there is normally. Some of that risk that we previously had been encountered has been taken away, because we now have, what I didn't mention on the previous slide was we now have a multi-year settlement from government. So we have a 3-year settlement that runs from 26-27 through to 28-29, and it's described as a minimum. So the future years are indicative, but they're indicative based on that being a minimum level. So we still have key risks around social care demand, for example, but inflation too, and we experience kind of exceptional inflation in certain service areas. So that's usually around children's placements. Sometimes we'll have higher than CPI inflation or consumer price index inflation associated with care providers, because that's often driven by the national living wage that runs higher than CPI. So for next year, national living wage increase of 4.1%, for example, from this coming April. We've just had a business rate revaluation. So there's a new valuation list from April 26, and that will bring with it a whole load of business rate appeals. So we have to see. We don't know what they will be. We make some assessments of the extent to which business rate appeals will be successful. The extent to which they're successful will obviously alter the amount of business rates we receive. As I mentioned earlier on, we retain 49% of all business rates received. If there are lots of appeals and lots of successful appeals, our business rate income will fall.
Chris, those business rate appeals, are they something the council deal with in-house? Is it a national thing? Is there a body they go to? What's the framework for those?
Yeah, they're dealt with by the Valuation Office agency, but it is often we find, and we actually find it with council tax as well, that a lot of residents think that it's the council that deal with business rate appeals and council tax bandings, and it's not. It's the Valuation Office agency, and they are an arm of HMRC. So yeah, so it is this then.
So when those changes come in and those appeals start coming in, it is largely out of our control.
It's entirely out of our control. We have no control over it whatsoever. Yeah. So obviously they're a risk. Council tax and business rate collection is a risk. The extent of how much we'll collect. Our collection rates are still lower than pre-pandemic levels. So our council tax collection rates are still recovering. But what you would expect is that you would expect us to be able to accommodate within the budget for next year any of those risks, any and all of those risks. So we have had years, not the current year, but previous years, where social care costs have appeared to be out of control. And we have a corporate contingency to accommodate a number of those things. So we've got a corporate contingency of just under 21 million to accommodate in-year risks. That's not built into the budget on an ongoing basis, but it provides a buffer, or at least 1 year's worth of comfort to be able to accommodate that, and then you would have to manage that through future years' savings if it was going to be a permanent feature of your cost base. But much of the contingents, so when I spoke earlier about the extra 3.7 million, for example, around temporary accommodation, that's provided for within that contingency. It's not embedded within the budget. And there's a number of other risks included within the contingency as well, particularly around social care. So that's the proposal for 26-27. So you can see that there's a lot of cost pressures. Spending's up by 16 million. There's potential risks, but we have got risk mitigation provided by the council's corporate contingency. And embedded within the budget, of course, now is around about £5 million provision to provide for capital investment as well. If we do my usual crystal ball gazing and say, what do we think the future looks like, and what do we think the future looks like for Portsmouth, or at least Portsmouth either by 29-30, or at least if we looked, and let's just say local government reorganisation takes place, if we looked at what the Portsmouth element of a new merged authority might look like. What I can't do is tell you what local government reorganisation looks like, because we're not there yet. But what I can tell you is if Portsmouth existed in its current state, this is what Portsmouth would look like, or Portsmouth Financial's position would look like. So you'll see I have my usual wheel, colour-coded. So in the middle we have a overall £3 million forecast deficit, and everything that is red around that wheel are, if you like, cost increases or cost pressures. Everything that is green is either income or cost reductions. In the main, it's funding. Excuse me. So if we wind everything forward and say, what does it look like if Portsmouth were to deliver steady state services? So no cuts to services compared to 2026-27. What does it look like providing the same level of services in 29-30 as we would be providing next financial year? So our inflation and pensions costs would have risen by 16.6 million. We anticipate, over and above inflation, this is additional social care pressures, adults and children's, of about 6.8. So that's usually around demographics and complexity. So it's genuine, additional, unavoidable cost growth. It's not normal inflation. That's already accommodated in the 16.6. Education, which is really homeschool transport, 0.6 million. We're still assuming that will continue, but it does obviously at 0.6 million indicate a flattening of EHCPs over that period, and we have a imminent white paper around that that is coming out around SEND. Environmental services up by 1.8 million. That is in the main our expectations of the new emissions tax, which I can't for the life of me remember what it's entitled. But the new emissions tax effectively from the incinerator, to ensure that it's only clean gases that come out of the incinerator and not dirty gases. Some lots of other things rolled up into the other 4.4 million. We're anticipating that government grants will increase by 8.7 million. So that is based on the local government finance settlement. So that's the minimum. So we're now pretty certain about that number. So there's a general uplift in government funding over the next 3 years. Business rates down compared to current year by 0.7 million. There's a couple of things going on there. We have got normal CPI increases, but it depends what your current year's position looks like. So. And obviously council tax increasing at 4.99% for each and every year, which is also the government's assumption. It's the government's assumption generally, and it's the government's assumption for when they have determined what local government funding looks like. Because you remember I said earlier on, governments say, what's your need, and we'll reduce your allocation according to need by how much you can raise locally from council tax, they're assuming we're increasing council tax by 4.99% each and every year. So that leaves us with a overall forecast £3 million deficit. But obviously there's crystal ball gazing in here. There's lots of assumptions. Many of our assumptions are based on the OBR's forecasts, for example. So they're not all our assumptions. They're assumptions that are made by eminent or the best economic forecasters around. So what you see there in terms of a budget saving strategy is, well, with a deficit of £3 million to find over 3 years, you would spread that evenly so that it's a smooth path towards the £3 million worth of savings that need to be made. That's obviously helpful in terms of service delivery, or certainly not destabilising services, because you haven't got big spikes, if you like, in the way that you arrive at your overall £3 million deficit. I think it's also fair to all administrations as well, because it evens it out over a period, regardless of what happens at the ballot box. But like I said, that deficit could be plus or minus 6 million. So on an annual basis, that deficit could be plus or minus 2 million. So the budget report suggests that from a planning perspective, once we get over 26-27, in 27-28, we'll probably, our base case assumption will be we have to make £1 million worth of savings, but it could be up to £3 million worth of savings, or it could be negative £1 million. I'm not sure how you make a negative saving, but we'll give it a go. So capital programme, I mentioned right at the top that it's pretty modest this time round in relative terms, but it's all set within, you'd expect us to have capital strategy, so a basis upon which to prioritise capital investment. Any capital strategy will say you've got to meet your statutory obligations, you've got statutory duties, you've got to meet them. It's not legal not to meet them, so it needs to feature as part of your capital strategy. Obviously you want to continue to provide services on a sustainable basis, so making sure that you meet your essential health and safety requirements, making sure that you have the right type of equipment for your business critical activities, and they're all up to date and secure. But also around protecting the environment and clean regeneration and clean economic growth. So 18.5 million available, but of which 13.4 is what we'd probably describe as the council's contribution to that. That's the flexible funding, no strings attached money. So it comes from places like revenue contributions, as I've mentioned. So I mentioned earlier on, this is why we need to be setting aside around about at least 5 million a year from the revenue budget to fund capital expenditure. It comes from community infrastructure levy, any capital receipts. We haven't had capital receipts for a long time, haven't sold much. Or any non-ring fence capital grants, and they're pretty sparse these days. I can't remember the last time I saw a non-ring fence capital grant, or not properly non-ring fenced anyway. There's external contributions within that 18.5. When you look at the budget papers, you'll see that the majority of that is actually related to one scheme, which is the King's Theatre redevelopment scheme. And there is £0.8 million from specific reserves. So there's a few other reserves that are set aside for a particular purpose, and that's funding some of the, or a small proportion of the 18.5. So the capital investment proposals, whilst I've not listed them in detail, they're in Appendix D of your budget papers. But what I have done is I've categorised them, and these almost align with what I just mentioned in terms of the capital strategy and about how you would prioritise your spending. So the first item is described as critical IT infrastructure and systems. So there's two big ones in here. One of them is just about the IT infrastructure itself and data switches and ensuring that they're up to date, upgraded and secure. The other one is an adult social care management system. There's funding for that in the existing programme, but it's not sufficient, so that it requires another couple of million on top, and that's so that it's Care Act compliant. So it's not a it's there more for statutory purposes than it is for, if you like, your operational management purposes. There's 3.4 million into what's described as community and civic assets. The largest part of that 3.4 million actually is the Spinnaker Tower. That's over £2 million, I think, about £2 million, I think. There's essential buildings maintenance. I mention this quite a lot in the budget report, actually, because if you imagine that if there's £13 million available and £2.5 million of that is going on your buildings maintenance, what is it squeezing out that you would otherwise like to have done? We've got a large operational estate, and it takes a lot of maintenance, and some of that estate is aging and is requiring a lot of maintenance. And the proposals in here are only for what's described as Category 1 priority repairs and maintenance. It goes on to about Category 4. So Category 1 is funded, and then there's a contingent amount of 650,000 for items that are in Category 2. Category 1 basically says likely to fail within 12 months. Category 2 talks about potential failure within 12 months to 2 years. So there's a contingent sum for Category 2 of 650,000 within that 2.5 million. So my point about this really is that over time you'll spend more and more money on maintaining buildings that may not be fit for purpose, and that's less and less money that's available for key capital aspirations and other needs. There's 2.3 million for highways maintenance and transport safety. Now, actually, when I said about the corporate capital resources, that also includes money from the LTP. It's not technically ring-fenced, but it is really, because we have to report on it, and if we don't have an approved local transport plan, then we don't get the money. And then there's a relatively modest amount on regeneration schemes of 0.9 million. Most of that is the city centre road scheme, just to keep that going for another 12 months. But that is obviously critical to the whole city centre regeneration. Inevitably, there's a gap between funding and aspirations and our obligations, and that's why I make such a point about the council, the amount of money the council is spending on maintaining its assets. The council is actually in the process, it's been in the process for some time now, of developing an asset management strategy. So it's going through every single asset, looking at it for its sufficiency, i.e. is it fit for purpose, does it meet the need that it's intended to meet, what are its repairs and maintenance obligations, what is its performance, i.e. in terms of what of its annual property costs, and so on, so that there's a proper strategy about holding the assets that you need to hold and making other choices about the assets that you don't need to hold. So just to sum up, £3 million for the savings, 4.99% increase in the council tax, balanced budgets, 25 for the current year and next year, and structurally balanced as well, which is good, which basically means you're not relying on any kind of one-off funding to balance the budget for 26-27. It's structurally balanced with the funding that's available. Future deficit, 3 years' time, round about 3 million, but could vary by plus or minus 6 million. Big risks, social care, as usual, SEND, children's placements, homelessness, buildings maintenance, business rates revaluation, and of course we've got the costs of local government reorganisation implementation, which I touch on in the report but haven't really mentioned too much in this presentation. The report sets out that if the case for change was correct in all of its estimates and assessments of how much it will cost just to implement local government reorganisation, the set-up costs, that is £132 million across the whole of Hampshire. That's what the case for change said. If we looked at that on a population share basis, Portsmouth's share of that would be 15 million. We are starting to set money aside in the council's MTRS reserve in order for the costs of that implementation. As are all other local authorities in the area. They are starting to set aside funding from their reserves in order to fund the cost of local government reorganisation. The vast majority of that burden, as you would expect, will fall on Hampshire County Council. On a population basis, the county council and the districts are about 70% population. Obviously, there's a split between the county and the districts in terms of upper and lower tier functions, and that usually is, I don't know, 85-15% split, something like that. I'll just do this last bit because I'm then at the end of the presentation. But from Portsmouth City Council's perspective, the financial health of the council is sound. That's the end of the presentation, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that in-depth, Chris. We're now moving into, let's start with questions first, because I can't imagine there could be too many comments, and that isn't normally. I've got Councillor Brown to start with.
Thank you, Chair. Chris, just touching on that last point about the local government reorganisation funding, obviously I know it's not directly relevant to this budget, but I think it does frame the budgets for the council moving forward for the next few years. I'm curious to know, is there any disparity when you were saying that Portsmouth's share was 15 million? Obviously, we've been operating as a unitary authority for a number of years, whereas a lot of authorities across Hampshire haven't. Is it more expensive to implement a new unitary authority for the areas that haven't been operating as unitaries? So is it, in a sense, do we get a discount for having been in a unitary already compared to what some of the other two-tier authorities would need to put aside? Or has that proportion been done purely on population numbers, not necessarily what it might actually cost to implement?
Yeah, I see what you mean. In terms of the implementation costs, they've been built up on the basis that unitary authorities exist and they will form anchor organisations. So you'd expect a lot of the cost of setting up unitary authorities will be in. Let's take another example where you're setting up a unitary authority from scratch. So if you're setting up a unitary authority from scratch, you haven't got any social care infrastructure whatsoever, you've got no highways infrastructure whatsoever, and you will need a different kind of management team as well than you would in a if it was based on a district, for example. So you need your adult social care systems, you need your children's social care systems, you'll probably need bigger corporate systems as well than a district would use. So in that sense, if you've got an anchor local authority such as a unitary that has those systems and those systems are scalable, which is an important point, which, to be fair, both Portsmouth systems and Southampton system should be scalable, then you're starting from a position of expansion rather than from new. Some things, the costs don't work in that way because it's based on the number of licenses, for example, when it comes to IT. So, but you do tend to get economies of scale associated with the overheads of managing those systems. So there's reduced costs built into the overall quantum of the 132 million. All I've sought to do here in terms of saying, and how is that 132 million apportioned across the different the different areas. I've just said, what does the population look like? So I've got nothing better to go on at this stage. So I haven't applied a discount when it comes to the apportionment. I've just said it. But then again, you've got the county council in the mix, which has also got its systems. But it won't have any housing systems, for example, because it's not a housing authority.
Thank you. And I did have one other question about council tax, but I think that probably got answered during the presentation. I think I saw the number, which was just asking about the delta between last year's council forecast and the actual increase rather than the net offset because of your plan, and accounting for a greater than usual level of uptake. So I think I saw that number in the presentation, so I'm not going to ask that.
Just as a general point, every 1% increase in the council tax raises about 1.1 million. So,
Actually, a slight question on that. What is our current level of actual collection compared to bills that go out?
Ballpark, it's about 96.5%, which, relative to our statistical neighbours, I would suggest well, I know it's below average. So performance-wise, in terms of collection, we are not one of the strongest collectors of council tax. That's partly, in practice, that is partly related to the extent to which the council wants.
Everybody back to their dressing rooms. We're all performers.
Yeah, there'll be a number of factors associated with that. Partly it will be the kind of prosperity of the city generally and the demographic, but partly it will be to do with the how aggressive a local authority is in terms of its collection practices. You know, how quickly and how persistently it might put council tax debts out to external enforcement officers, for example.
And if 1% of council tax equates to $1 million and change, then that means that our non-collected council tax is worth about $3.5 million.
Councillor Heaney.
Yes, Chris, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask a question about the issue you raised in your presentation about the assumptions of government about council tax increases. Obviously, you've said that there's an assumption in this settlement that the increase will be 4.995%. That's been true for recent years, but I think, if I am correct, that has been the case if we take the baseline to 11-12 for each year since 2011-12, except for those years where the government gave local authorities a one-off payment for not raising council tax, but then took it away the following year. So you then had to... So really, is it correct that the assumption has always been since 2011-12 that will be some sort of council tax rise, except for that exception I mentioned?
Yeah, it's been 4.99% for as long as I can remember. So it has been for a number of years. And it's even when we didn't have a 3-year settlement, we've looked, in terms of our forecasting, we've looked to see what the OBR's assumptions are when they do their forecasting for government, and they have been embedding 4.99% into their assumptions for as many years as I can remember.
Any more questions? Councillor Madrick.
Thank you. Yeah, so mine was in relation to the adult social care saving. I was a bit concerned because obviously it's a market-led approach on the domiciliary care. And I didn't really understand how the service wouldn't be affected in any capacity whatsoever. Meanwhile, cutting the budget by 1.2 million. Because it says here, residents will continue to receive the care that meets their assessed needs. But I just felt it was a bit misleading because this is kind of more of an assertion rather than evidence-based, based on the report, obviously. And our budget's then assuming that the market will absorb the 1.2 million reduction without providers exiting, reduced availability and increased delay discharging people from NHS care. And I'm just a bit worried about that. And like, I guess, what our foresight is in relation to how the market reacts to that. Because if that is a market decision, and the market reacts badly to that, or the market falls or collapses or increases, then how are we planning for that moving forward?
It is our expectation that will be contained within the market, and in part it's because the providers in Portsmouth, paid by Portsmouth, are paid higher than our geographical neighbours. So there's a degree of confidence that can be sustained because that level of, in effect, reduced provider payment is being made already in other neighbouring local authorities.
So, just if, I mean, say, as you just said the word assuming, because other neighbouring authorities do, if that doesn't materialise by mid-year, what specific budgets will absorb the overspend and kind of what services will then be affected by it? Because it's quite a lot. We're talking 1.2 million. This isn't 10 grand or 20 grand.
No, I mean you're correct. It's a significant amount of money, and that's part of the reason that I mentioned earlier in the presentation about having a contingency that's provided for at 20.9 million, because we provide within that contingency for all known and anticipated risks, in particular relating to social care, but also everything else that you could possibly think of.
Thank you very much. I've probably got a very simple Simon question if I can ask it. Looking at the slides, the budget on a page shows the government funding up 16.1 million, but you said that includes 6.6 of existing grants. Then a couple of pages later on local government finance settlement, you've got the same thing, but I'm interpreting that as actually being the government settlement of 11.6 million. Am I correct in that? Sorry, 9.6 million. So we've had 9.6 million government funding this year. So that's what that's saying to me. So am I also correct then, if I look at last year's budget at a glance, we actually got more money last year from the government than we are this year? Is it showing it as 14.3 million last year?
We have me at disadvantage because I haven't got that in front of me. But if what we have seen in recent years is significant additional money provided for social care. We haven't seen that we didn't see that come through in the comprehensive spending review. Those continual significant increases. I don't recall it being 14.3 million, but I may be wrong.
I'm looking at last year's budget at a glance, the same sort of thing. Funding up 19.2 million, government 14.3, council tax 7,
Yeah, okay.
business rates in red 2.1.
Yeah.
So I'm just looking at a government like for like, and so last year's one says 14.3. This year is actually 9.6.
The big change in last year was the introduction of this thing called the recovery grant.
Right.
So the recovery grant added £5.1 million worth of extra funding to the local authority, and I think from memory something like the top 50 or so deprived. It's this issue that I've just mentioned earlier on about what's happening with the funding formula. So those councils that were relatively more deprived and with a relatively weaker tax base received funding through the recovery grant, and Portsmouth was one of those. I think we were in the top 50 of that bracket, and that has been continued, but not on an increasing basis, but on a flat basis through the settlement the provisional settlement that was announced. So I think that's the difference. It's that 5.1. We had that.
That's been done over a period of time, is it?
It was introduced for the current year that we're in now, so it would have been in those numbers that you've referenced, Councillor. But it's now embedded within the settlement, so it wasn't a one-off. It's ongoing, but it's not increasing by 5.1 each and every year. It's staying broadly constant.
So that would feature in your little asterisk, 6.6 million of existing grants reclassified. Within that part?
No, it's not. I think because what you've seen last time round is a step up of 5.1. This time round, you're not seeing that another 5.1, so you're not seeing another step up. You're seeing a general constant level of funding.
Numbers still say a decrease to me from the government, so yeah.
It's a decrease in the amounts that the money has gone up by, not the amount of raw money.
It's a reduction in the rate of increase. Yeah.
You're obviously a script writer on Yes Minister, Councillor Brown.
Just call me Humphrey.
Do we have any more questions, members? Councillor Madrick.
Yeah, I did bring up this to Rian, so hopefully you got a little bit of insight. I may as well bring it up now in a public meeting. Obviously, there's a line in there that says about the reduced ferry port surplus. I'm going to say I did bring this up to Rian, so hopefully she cited you. But obviously, the budget highlights reduced commercial ferry port trading surpluses. Can you quantify the reduction compared to previous forecasts and explain how sensitive the general fund now will be to further changes in port performance?
So from memory, I think the change between the years is don't quote me, but from memory, I think it's about 1.8 million. And it is largely to do with shore power and the additional costs, mainly the stand-in charge cost of shore power on the quay, which will only recover over time as and when more and more ships plug in and take electric from the quay. So it's a short to medium term loss before it recovers.
We're politicians, of course we won't quote you. So at what point would the ferry port then cease to be considered as a net contributor? Because obviously you're talking about there being a surplus potentially before thing. And at what point would we reclassify it as a financial risk to the council? I mean, at what point do we get to where we're not making a profit before we classify it as a risk?
Well, at the moment, setting aside the difficulty associated with what we describe as depreciation. So setting aside the difficulty associated with depreciation, which is basically charging your capital costs on an annual basis to your revenue budget. Set that aside for now, and what comes into the council excluding that. The trade-in surpluses or the dividend to the council is around about £10 million. So it's still quite significant. If you were then to layer in, those annualised capital costs, we don't collect that separately from the port, separately identifiable to the port, because we have no requirement to. So we've never done it. If we were to do that, we'd have to estimate it. So if we were looking for a commercial set of accounts, for example, and trying to turn that into a profit and loss account that had depreciation associated with it, we couldn't do that readily. Albeit we could probably make an estimate if we had to. But there's a considerable surplus still made and a considerable dividend still made to the council.
Thank you, Chris.
Any more questions, members? Does any member want to stick their head above the parapet and make any comments? I suspect everybody's waiting for the budget meeting to make their comments. Okay, thank you very much for that, Chris, for an in-depth meeting, and thank you to your team as well, I think, for probably assisting in putting it together. Just going back to the agenda, that is the presentation, and that will obviously that report will go forward to Cabinet at some point. So I think we've ticked our box as far as scrutiny management is concerned. And on that note, I'll call the meeting to an end at 25.